Summary of Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville starts Democracy in America by talking about how things are in his own country, France, at the time. Even though France and most of Europe have been home to aristocratic monarchies for a long time, where a king and queen rule, but an aristocratic class also has power and privileges based on birth, equality of condition, a leveling out of social class hierarchies, is replacing these traditions more and more. Tocqueville talks about some of the big historical reasons for these changes, and then he says that he is afraid of this process of democracy spreading. But since it's impossible to stop the forces of democratization, he says it would be helpful to look at the model of American democracy, where equality of conditions has grown more than anywhere else. Tocqueville first talks about the foundations of American society by telling the story of the Pilgrims, who came from England, and how the people's authority was established early on, especially through the way power was spread to different townships. He says that this helps to reduce the risks of highly centralized government, which can make a country dull or enervate it. Tocqueville goes into detail about several parts of America's federalist system, which divides power between the national capital, the states, and local townships. He focuses on how this system keeps people free and encourages them to get involved in their country's politics. Democratic judges are a great example of how people in America take part in politics. After talking about some of the pros and cons of being big, Tocqueville talks about how America has dodged the problems that come with being big. He goes back to talking about early American history and the arguments about how to split power, which led to the political parties we have today. Tocqueville also talks about how powerful the press is in America. He praises the press as a civic institution that helps spread political knowledge and supports freedom. Americans keep their political rights as individuals in other ways, like by joining political groups. In fact, Tocqueville believes that political rights and education are important for promoting freedom, and he says that Americans have, for the most part, been successful in promoting these rights, even though he also points out some bad things about how involved Americans are in politics. Tocqueville then talks about what he thinks is the most important part of American society, the sovereignty of the people. He warns that this can be just as bad as a single dictator. He worries that the strength of democratic institutions in America could lead to the downfall of the country one day. This is in contrast to many of his co-workers, who worry that the weakness of democracy could lead to chaos. Tocqueville also says that America has found a number of ways to stop the rule of the majority, especially through the law and the jury system, political groups, and the effects of Puritanism on early America. In the end of Part 1, he admits that he doesn't think France or other countries should copy the American system. However, he believes that American democracy has been very flexible and effective. In Part 2, Tocqueville pays much more attention to non-political or extra-political parts of American society. He also has more doubts than he did in Part 1 about how American democracy affects social life. He says that Americans don't care much about theory or abstract ideas and prefer things to be simple and clear. This is one reason why religion can be so helpful in a democracy. It is a clear, but limited, source of authority, and it can also help reduce the materialism and greed that Tocqueville says are common in democratic societies. Tocqueville says that science, writing, and the arts haven't changed much in America, and he tries to find political reasons for this. He thinks that the bad thing about democratic equality is that it makes people care most about their material needs in getting ahead in the economy, leaving them little time or interest for more abstract, intellectual matters. Still, as more and more people are able to get out of desperate poverty, the number of people interested in science will only go up, even if the level of scientific research isn't as good as in an aristocracy. Tocqueville still says that Americans value the real over the theoretical, the helpful over the beautiful, and the concrete over the abstract. Because of this, the United States and other governments will tend to make more and cheaper goods instead of fewer, better-made ones. Tocqueville uses the same kind of argument to say that America doesn't have its own literature. He thinks that American life is not beautiful. But he also tries to picture what poetry will be like in the future. He thinks that democratic poetry will focus more on the nature of people and try to explain everything about them. Tocqueville then goes back to his original point, which was that freedom and equality don't always go together and that governments will always put equality ahead of freedom. He thinks that America's independence comes from equality and helps to keep it, even though it makes it harder for people to get along with each other and threatens the way society works. He thinks that the fact that people don't care about each other is what makes democracies especially vulnerable to despotism, even though the many political and civic groups in the United States have worked against this kind of danger. In fact, Tocqueville turns his attention to the different civic organizations, like town halls and temperance societies, that bring people together and work against individualism and materialism. Tocqueville then talks about another part of American culture, how Americans seem to have a lot of physical energy. He says that this comes from the fact that they are always busy and try to make their lives better. He also thinks that industry and commerce are the most important things in America because people want to get rich and have much more opportunity to do so than in an aristocracy. However, he warns that the concentration of wealth in a manufacturing class could make it harder for people to move up in society. Tocqueville also talks about how Americans have bad manners and don't care about etiquette. He compares this to the way Europeans act and also says that Americans are vain and proud. Tocqueville then talks for a while about the institution of the family in America, where fathers and sons get along better than they do in Europe, where a sense of patriarchal power makes family relationships stiff and forced. Tocqueville also says good things about how women are treated in America, where they have much more freedom and respect than in Europe. He likes how educated they are and thinks that education should be given to women as part of giving everyone the same political rights. He thinks that women are very important to the success of American democracy, even though he also says that this is because they are limited to the home. In fact, Tocqueville thinks that America has accepted the natural differences between men and women, which means that there is actually more equality between the sexes in the US. Tocqueville goes on to talk about other things about American manners, like how people act the same way and how vain Americans are. He also talks about how people's lives become more and more the same, making them boring. Tocqueville is afraid of the enervating effects of people having the same behaviors, attitudes, and ways of life. He says that Americans are ambitious, but that their goals don't go too far. Americans value peace and stability more than anything else, so they aren't likely to want to take over or go to war. Europe is much more rebellious than the United States because democracy hasn't taken hold there yet. In fact, Tocqueville insists on the link between democracy and peace, even as he points out some of the strange things about democratic armies, whose soldiers are different from those in other democratic countries because they want to fight. Tocqueville goes back to his worry that democracies will continue to want more and more centralized power, partly because they like peace and security. So far, America has been able to avoid such risks because its people have had a long time to get used to their freedoms and to being involved in politics on many different levels. Still, putting too much power in one place is a big risk in a democracy. At the same time, though, the tyranny of the majority may be the biggest threat to a democracy. Tocqueville describes a number of possible future democratic societies where everyone thinks and acts the same way and where tyranny is fought in a subtle, sneaky, but no less powerful way. As he comes to an end, he admits that it's hard, if not impossible, to predict the future. He's saddened by the way people's lives are becoming more similar, but he also says that this may be a necessary result of making everyone more equal. In any case, he says that you can't and shouldn't go back in time. However, he ends by saying that people have the power to change their historical circumstances by working within the large processes of democratization to keep and increase individual freedoms.
About the author. Tocqueville was born into a family of Catholic aristocrats who owned an old house in Normandy. During the French Revolution, several of his family members were put to death because they supported the royal family. Before he became a lawyer and judge, he went to school in Metz, France. He met Gustave de Beaumont, a lawyer, while he was at work in Versailles. During the uncertain last months of the Bourbon Restoration, the two men, who would later become close friends, decided to suggest a trip to the United States to study its unique prison system, which many in France wanted to copy. In 1831, they went to America for a 9-month stay. Tocqueville gave his friend more and more responsibility for the prison project, and the two of them released their findings about American prisons in 1833. For the next 8 years, Tocqueville worked on Democracy in America, which was published in 2 volumes in 1835 and 1840. Tocqueville was chosen to the French Chamber des Députés in 1841. He served in this position until the revolutions of 1848, after which he quit politics for good. Tocqueville's last book, The Old Regime and the Revolution, came out in 1856. 3 years later, in 1859, he died from TB.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.